I'm so excited you're here, Paul. I actually was listening to something, heard of the concept of Watiko, got into one of my mind rabbit holes where then I was just looking up YouTube videos and books and found your book, Undreaming Watiko, and reached out to you to bring you on. So I'm curious, can you tell us what Watiko means and how you first came in contact with the idea?
For sure. Well, it's a Native American word, and and in their cosmology, it really connotes, in a way, the spirit of evil. It's a cannibalistic spirit, and once I came across it and I began to study it, I right away began to recognize, oh my God, this I had been calling it. I had made up my own name because I'd been tracking something in the course of my life that was informing this incredible evil that was playing out in the world, in certain people, in certain scenarios, in certain relationships. And so how I discovered it was in my own life, and the story isn't important, but it was in my family, and and it was particularly with my father. Like I'm saying, the story isn't important, but he just seemed to be taken over by something. And it was really interesting to me because when I began to try to understand what I was seeing, at a certain point I began to have the realization that this energy, it wasn't just coming through the person of my father, but it was informing and configuring the entire field, the non-local field. And that word, so instead of it being local, in other words, instead of it being having a location in space and time, it was non-local, which is really a physics term, which has to do with that it transcends third dimensional space and time. So what I'm trying to say is that by just my own direct experience, I was having an encounter with evil, basically. And it wasn't just the personal evil of my father, it was more like the archetypal evil that myths and fairy tales really symbolize. And I was beginning to recognize, oh my God, I'm having this revelation as this evil was playing out in my life, and it completely destroyed my entire family. I haven't had a family for over 20 years. And so, it was something that came out of my own direct experience. And as I tried to wrap my mind around what I was experiencing, because I'm very academic and sort of, kind of a nerd, so I was studying, trying to understand stuff. And the more I went down that rabbit hole, the more that I realized, yeah, indigenous communities really were tracking this. And so I've written 3 books on Wateco. And I've just, as a modern person, I've just created a psychological idiom to make it more understandable. And it's totally 100%, it's what's at the bottom of what's playing out in the body politic of the world. Because Watiko is a collective psychosis, but it's also very quantum in nature. And what I mean, I also have written a book on quantum physics. What I mean by that is that, think about light. What is the nature of light? Well, is it a wave or a particle? Well, it depends how it's observed. Being quantum in nature, Watiko is the source of the most incredible evil on every scale, both in our minds, individually, interrelationally, and collectively. But it's also holographically encoded within Watiko, is not only its own medicine and its own vaccine, but it's actually helping us to awaken. It's catalyzing the evolution of our species. So it's either going to kill us and take us down or wake us up. And how it manifests, it depends if we recognize what it's showing us. It's a revelation. That's what I was realizing, that, oh my God, with what was happening with my father that eventually destroyed my entire family, I realized at a certain point, oh my God, I've been given a revelation, but instead of from the heavens and coming through a beam of light, it was coming through the darkness, through evil. And so that just transformed my entire life. And I've been trying to get across to people, and very thankfully, more and more people all over the world are, hearing about Watiko. And one way of understanding it, it's a mind virus. And when people hear that and it sounds all woo or new agey, all that means is that the origin of the collective insanity that we are playing out in the world is to be found within the human psyche. And that's a no-brainer. Where else, not only the origin, but the solution of our collective madness, as well as the origin, is to be found within the collective psyche. That's what a mind virus means. And, so we found the diagnosis. There's not any question that, oh yeah, the origin of the madness. I mean, we're destroying the life support system of our planet. We're destroying ourselves. If that's not collective insanity, I don't know what is. And, so at least now we've gotten the diagnosis, we've found the name, but then the whole question, what do we do? That's a whole other question.
Yeah, I feel like my understanding of this existence or this dream we're in has evolved a lot in the last few years, even more so than before. And I think it's because I it's like I dug into my beliefs so much and there was something missing. And of the idea of self-sabotage just sort of makes sense because often self-sabotage also involves leaning into something that's just tempting in one way or another, whether it's meant to be addictive, whether it's has too much pleasure, but that doesn't necessarily explain some of the really insidious evil that happens on this planet, just the really dark things. And so I came to the idea of Wateco when I was trying to understand that. Like, what about some of these things that just seem just evil for evil's sake or just not taking the collective into account at all? And so I kind of came back to the idea of dark forces and then Watiko showed up in my life and I was like, well, thank you for answering the question that I was putting out there. But I'm curious, when you talk about it spreading potentially through families, what does that look like? Because we often understand our own ability to self-sabotage, or we can see like, oh, we're destroying the planet because we're all being selfish. But you're talking about the potential of somebody to be going through something really dark and it just to spread through a collective of people. That seems to
Yeah.
add another layer to this.
Yeah. Well, the thing about this mind virus, about Wetiko, is that it's a field phenomena. So in other words, one way of really, a very simple way of understanding what is Wetiko, it's this misidentification of who we think we are. When we identify ourselves as being, think about like of us as being a separate self. Oh, I exist over here and I'm separate from you, so you're an other. Well, as soon as I identify with a separate self and you're an other, well, then there's fear. And fear is the superfood for Watiko. So the idea being that being a field phenomena, say, for example, if I fall into my unconscious, and who hasn't acted out their unconscious, and say for a moment, because we all potentially have Watiko, it exists in potential in the collective unconscious, and say if I then act out, Watiko unconsciously in whatever form I do, and you see that, well, the thing about Watiko, it's non-local. There's no way for you to see me acting out Watiko without all of a sudden that same vibration getting ignited in you because it's non-local. This is similar to how it's impossible to see the unconscious, to see somebody who's like acting out the unconscious without your unconscious being activated. So if you see me embodying and playing out Watiko, and then you're seeing that activates it in you, well, unless you actually have the awareness to self-reflect and to look at, oh, what in me is getting activated by seeing Paul's Watiko, then you're just then it's contagious. Then if you don't do that self-reflection, then it spreads in the field. And then what happens, you see, Watiko, it's a collective psychosis. So when people get fixed in a particular viewpoint and they congregate together and they reinforce each other's viewpoint, whatever the viewpoint is, but it's not necessarily a true viewpoint. They could be all in agreement that, say some political candidate is great or terrible or whatever. But when enough people really get into agreement, it's as if this impenetrable bubble gets conjured up around them. So anybody reflecting that they might be reinforcing each other's unconscious gets demonized and seen as a threat. So the idea is that being a collective psychosis, like a psychic epidemic that's very contagious, because it operates through the unconscious blind spots. You see, the thing about Watiko, it's a form of blindness, but it's a peculiar form of blindness that it does not know that it's blind. It actually thinks it's seeing, and so when people who are suffering from this get together, they can all reinforce each other's blindness in a way that, if they have their hands on the levers of power, they can create a total nightmare. And, in one way, I'm describing what's happening in the world. So that's why it's really important, for people who are awakening to our nature. And when I reference our nature, what does that even mean? Well, our true nature is that we're not separate. We're interconnected. We're interdependent. And seeing that, the energetic realization, the energetic expression of that is love, is compassion, where we're here to be in service to each other. If I help you, well, it helps me because ultimately we're not separate. You see, that's the antidote for Watiko, which is very much, just remember, it's a misidentification of who we think we are. As soon as I identify myself as being a separate self, and I think that's who I am, then I'm going to dream up all the evidence I need to confirm that point of view that I do exist as a separate self. It becomes a self-replicating feedback loop. And so what my work is trying to shed light on that, yeah.
I love when different traditions speak to the same idea, which happens so often, and that's usually when I know that that's where truth is or what I can trust more. And I'm reminded of A Course in Miracles. They call it a tiny mad idea. Into eternity where all is one, there crept a tiny mad idea at which the Son of God remembered not to laugh. And it's like just this brief moment, but we're so powerful that we created that thought, that
Right.
existence
Well,
by just a thought.
yeah, well, it's interesting. So many, I'm a student of the Course in Miracles for years, and so many students of the Course in Miracles, after studying my work on Wateco, they'll get in touch with me and they'll say, "Have you read the Course in Miracles?" Because it's saying exactly the same thing. Because the Course in Miracles, it's basically saying this is a dream. I mean, that's the foundational perspective of the Course. And this tiny mad idea, it creeps in, and then it will draw all the evidence, and it'll just keep on reinforcing and confirming itself. And if I could just give an example, like say, for example, if I'm in a dream, in a night dream, and if I'm holding whatever perspective I'm holding in the night dream, say, for example, if the perspective I'm holding is that this world that I'm in is objective and it's real and solid and separate from me, that's the perspective I'm holding in a dream. Now, what is a dream? A dream is a reflection of the mind. It's a projection of the mind. So if I'm holding the viewpoint that this world that I'm inhabiting is real and solid and separate from me, then the dream will, being a reflection, it has no choice but to just offer me all the evidence confirming my viewpoint. So now I have proof that my viewpoint that the world is objective is true, so I get even more fixed in my viewpoint. And the more fixed in my viewpoint, the more the dream will just offer me evidence confirming the truth of my viewpoint ad infinitum in a self-reinforcing feedback loop in which I've entranced myself. What I've just described, I've hypnotized myself by my own creative genius. And in a sense, that's what Watiko is. We all have this incredible, practically unimaginably vast creative power to create our experience. of ourselves and of the world. But to the extent we're unconscious of it, we're wielding it unconsciously in a way that's killing us. And so, and it was a result of my direct encounter with archetypal evil that I referenced earlier. Like I said, it destroyed my entire family. Somehow I was fortunate enough to have the recognition that I was having a revelation, and it unlocked the most unbelievably just incredible creativity that I was realizing, oh my God, this isn't just my nature. It's not just, oh, I'm a creative person. No, this is all of our nature. We are incredibly creative beings, but to the extent we're not aware of it, it's like we outsource our creativity, and the powers that be are more than happy to plug into our own creativity that we're not picking up consciously and using it against us. And that's exactly what's happening.
This is so great, because this is what I'm constantly teaching about, how I think a lot of people think you can put your creator powers on hold. Like, we come up with this idea of manifesting, and we think it's something that we can use sometimes. And so many people don't realize that we are always creating, whether we're taking that under conscious control or not. And so our only choice is whether we're creating consciously or by default, by our programming, by all of the beliefs we've left unchecked, by the mind viruses, by the people around us and what they're believing. And I just think as I said, there was always something kind of missing until this idea of Watiko. And I think it's because of my personal experience with an eating disorder and other addictions. Part of how I finally moved through that was actually by othering my eating disorder. I remember I felt like I had a really big breakthrough when I started to look at it as like this little demon, and I'd say like, not today, or I talk to it. And something about that actually helped me to detach from it more than anything I had tried before. And I think a big part of it was because no matter how hard I would try, part of me identified with it. Part of it was a little bit of a personal failure, even though I had read that it wasn't an addiction. It was an addiction and all of this stuff. And so I remember during that time, I was like, was my old religion right about demons and whatnot? Because why is this so helpful by making it an almost being? And so Watiko was the first thing outside of the religion that I was raised in that explained it in a way that felt real to me.
Yeah. Well, I just appreciate what you just described, because that's, in essence, the idea of when we're unconscious of something, when we're unconsciously identified with something, we can't see it. It's the lens through which we see the world. And so the real process of freeing ourselves from that, because when we're unconsciously identified with something, that something gets in the driver's seat of our vehicle, and we just compulsively act out in a way as if we're puppets on a string. And so the idea is, the way to free ourselves from that unconscious energy that we're identified with is to objectify it, just like you were saying. Put it outside of yourself. By doing that, give it a shape, give it a form, give it a name, have a dialogue with it. By doing that, you've distinguished yourself from it. In other words, now here's it and here's you, and there's some sort of relationship, instead of you being codependently enmeshed and entangled with it in such a way that you can't see it. Then it's riding you, it's driving you, So I just really appreciated your description of your process with the eating disorder. And so many people I know, whether who've had eating disorders, addictions, alcoholics, are the most amazing healers, because they, the whole thing was some sort of initiatory ordeal where they descended into the darkness of the unconscious. And it's a great danger to get stuck there, and it could just destroy a person's life. But if you somehow are able, whether it's the courage or strength or love or a blessing, whatever it is that enables you to not get caught in that underworld. This is the deeper archetype of the shaman, and the shaman is the wounded healer. And the wounded healer shaman is the creative artist. It's the storyteller. It's the dreamer. And the myth is the shaman, and nobody would ever choose to be a shaman because the suffering is so over the top, but it's something you get called by the spirits, by the unconscious psychic forces. And the big thing is to assent, is to say, okay, I will follow this calling, because if the would-be shaman says, no, 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 I'm not good enough, it's inconvenient, that's when they get really sick. But the idea is to descend into that underworld, the place of demons and death and madness, and actually at a certain point pass through that and come back to the world. And typically the shaman bears gifts, and the gifts are their creativity, which they've unlocked as a result of their descent into the darkness.
That reminds me of a quote that I've heard: religion is for people who are afraid of going to hell. Spirituality is for people who have been there. And that's
great. Yeah.
That just rings so true to me, because even when I think back to that time period, I have a few core memories. I don't know why those are the ones that stand out, but where it's just this loop of darkness, and I feel so pulled and I can't get out of it. And I'll have these brief moments of awareness of like, I've been stuck here for 8 years, and how am I ever going to get out? Like, this is hell. So understanding that, it made descriptions of hell more visceral. And I was like, okay, well, yeah, I've already been there. I don't have to worry about going there when I die. But one of the things that you talk about, or that you shared earlier, was around how you need, when you see somebody basically projecting their unconscious, projecting their darkness, that you need to reflect in order to not absorb it yourself. Tell me more about that.
Yeah. Well, the idea is, say if you see somebody who's taken over by their unconscious shadow, one of, if not the main symptoms of when somebody is in their shadow is that they project the shadow out there, and they're unconsciously identified. They see the evil that's taken them over. They see it in projected form, and if they they project the shadow, and if they're projecting the shadow on you, it's even though a projection isn't a palpable thing that has a weight, but it is a palpable energy that can make one sick. It's black magic. It's the essence of black magic. And the idea is, if somebody's projecting their shadow on you, it's only problematic if you take the bait and get hooked, to actually buy into it and agree to their perspective of you. And then as soon as you get hooked and are in agreement with their shadow projection on you, then in a sense you're caught. But the idea is, when somebody's projecting the shadow on us, by self-reflecting, we find the hook in us, and think about it like if you have a coat and you want to hang the coat on a hook, right? So, it's not just, oh, no, I'm just completely innocent and they're just projecting a shadow on me. No, there's always, even if it's like the littlest, minutest little hook that is attracting the shadow projection. And by finding that in yourself, and by having the recognition, oh, the darkness I'm seeing that person being taken over by, and they're embodying it, I'm actually looking in a mirror. And etymologically, the word mirror means holder of the shadow. So that is to say, if you're seeing them as taken over by their own shadow and projecting onto you, they're a reflection of that part of yourself. So the idea is to add, it's such an incredible opportunity to add consciousness to what's getting touched in you. Where's that hook in you? How are you reacting? How are you then, reacting in kind by projecting the shadow back on them? It's an incredible opportunity to add light to your unconscious, as compared to just feeling victimized or just getting taken over by your shadow and doing the same thing.
I have been working with this recently. It's the message has been showing up a lot, so I believe that I'm being given my next level of awareness, but I've been constantly given them this in different forms, this idea of projections. And I always thought I understood it, but I think I've been understanding it on a different level. And recently I was listening to another podcast called Elevated Consciousness by Alessandro Giannetti, who was just on the show, but he had a whole episode on the law of reflections and how everything that shows up in your life is a reflection for you to see back. It's an opportunity to say, okay, why did I just see that giant car accident? Like, where in my life am I a wreck? Why am I noticing so many people lying or noticing deception? Like, where in my life am I not being honest? And it's been really deep practice. It's bringing a lot more conscious awareness to things that I normally would have passed by and said this has nothing to do with me. And instead I'm almost using the every single moment as a part of my inner work.
Yeah. Well, what you're describing, I mean, you see, when I encountered Watiko, way back when I was in my early 20s, and, I don't think anybody could be prepared for a direct encounter with that. And it created such an incredible wound or trauma or, pain in me. And I went so deeply inwards, into my own mind. And after a couple of years had this spiritual awakening in which I began to recognize, oh, this is a dream. This is a collective dream that we're having. And very interestingly, I'm really into the work of Carl Jung, and he spent his whole career trying to get across to people the profundity of cultivating what he called symbolic awareness. And symbols are the language of dreams. So in other words, he was trying to get across to people to see their life as if it's a dream and to interpret it symbolically. So if all of a sudden there's a big car wreck and it's like, oh yeah, wow, what is this symbolizing in me? And it's very playful and it's very fun, but it can really unlock, our mind in a really helpful way, in that it can really unlock our creative nature. And so the idea of, this guest you mentioned who is teaching about that, that's very much in alignment with what Jung spent his whole life trying to get across to people, to develop symbolic awareness.
When we talk about this existence being a collective dream, I know that a lot of people get confused about this because on one hand, we are agreeing to things that aren't real. And people have used examples like it can be the idea of money. Like, it doesn't actually hold value, yet we all have agreed it does. The government can't actually have power over us, yet we all have agreed it does. And so in a way, we're kind of collectively dreaming the structure of our world. But on another level, we're all in individual dreams able to individually experience the same moment that we were all present for in completely different ways based on what we are holding within ourselves or the beliefs that we have or what's important to us. How do you discern that dream and the different levels of it, the collective part versus what's individual?
Yeah, well, what comes up, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and we could spend, hours just contemplating that. But what comes up for me is the idea of, think about if there is like this rainbow. And if you and I are seeing this rainbow, well, there's no objective rainbow out there. All that the experience of a rainbow is we are having the experience of an image of a rainbow in our mind, right? It's just an image in our mind. There's no objective rainbow out there, because a rainbow, think about it, is composed of three factors, of light, of water, and of a mind. And when those three factors come together in a certain way, we then have the experience of a rainbow. But there is no objective rainbow. So if you and I are seeing a rainbow, if we're hanging out together, we're not seeing the same rainbow, because you're at a little bit of a different angle. We're each seeing our own private rainbow. Now, quantum physics and Tibetan Buddhism, and from the point of view of this being a dream, they're all in agreement saying this universe is like that rainbow, that there's no objective universe out there. We're all having our own private experience, but we've, like you were saying about with money or the government, we've agreed to navigate it, with certain shared constructs, that help us in a way to interact with each other in a way that could be helpful. And but this is really interesting because one of the fundamental qualities of Watiko is that we then think that this world exists separate from us and that this world exists objectively. And it's being like a dream. If I'm in a dream and I think the world exists objectively, the dream will give me all the evidence confirming my viewpoint because it's just a reflection of my mind. And then if I think the world exists objectively, that's only half of it. The other half of it is that, then I'm a subject, I'm an ego that's separate from the world, that's in relationship to the object of the world. And then that illusion of me being an ego, a subject, separate self, and the world being an object, they reciprocally reinforce each other. That's an illusion generating an illusion. And that's, in Buddhism, that's called samsara, that's called cyclic existence, the endless wheel of death and rebirth, the endless wheel of suffering. And that's what the Course in Miracles is trying to dispel. That's what my work in Wateco is trying to dispel. That's what Christ was trying to teach us. That's what Buddha was trying. They're all trying to point out the same thing, and that we are colluding in creating this illusion. We are complicit in creating our own victimization, and it just self-generates endlessly until we actually have to have the realization. And it's very much like the ancestral sort of lineage of abuse that gets passed down through the multiple generations, and that just continually regenerates itself over the generations until one person says, no, I'm going to do my work and self-reflect and stop the endless chain, and I'm not going to be a link in the chain passing it on to my offspring. And of course, that's us in potential. It's up to any one of us to be that person who's going to say, no, I'm going to take responsibility, and I'm not just going to be unconsciously colluding in this illusion, generating an illusion just ad infinitum, and I'm going to really, discover what is my nature, who am I?
It makes you wonder, how many agreements do we have to make before Watiko penetrates us? And what I mean by that is, so often the things that we're taken by show up outside of us first, like you said, in somebody else being overtaken by Watiko, in a family member, in something that we begin to accept as normal. And my belief is that often we'll see things at a distance and it'll get closer and closer until we are forced to make the awareness, or it'll take over our body and even turn into physical illness. And so can we avoid so much of our own suffering by actually just processing what we're witnessing?
Yeah, well, the thing about Wateco, this is important to understand because, we've only barely even scratched the surface. That's why I've written 3 books, is that it's an archetypal energy. And what that really means, it's transpersonal. It's not just a personal energy, it's beyond the personal. And being transpersonal or archetypal, this energy has the power to take over a person. And they can be oblivious to that has happened. But my father taught me this because he actually, unwittingly just acted this out. He became an unwitting instrument, a conduit for this, think about it like a higher dimensional energy that literally took him over, and he just became the instrument to act out this darker force. And all the while, he was oblivious. He had no idea, and it's able not just to take over a person, this Watiko, this transpersonal energy. It can take over a group of people, a collective, a nation, a species. And, or I should say, but you see, the way the unconscious works is that when we're unconsciously identified with something, we can't see it because it's the lens through which we see. So we project it outside of ourselves. So the unconscious always approaches us in this circuitous route. It approaches us from outside of ourselves. So we first recognize the unconscious content out there in projected form. And if we're not awake, we then, oh, out there is the evil or whatever, say if it's something dark. And as soon as we get into that viewpoint, then we're unwittingly colluding, then we're projecting our own shadow. Oh, that person is carrying the shadow. And the more we do that, the more unconsciously we're identified with just being light and the darkness is out there. And then what begins to happen is that we want to, when you amplify that process, like working on a dream, that carrier of our shadow, we typically want to destroy them. And that's really interesting because that's an externalization of the very initial internal process of wanting to exterminate our own darkness, our own evil, which was at the bottom of the shadow projection that started the whole process. So then in trying to destroy them, we're actually enacting in the outer world the very inner process that started the whole projection of the shadow. You see, because Watiko, it's so, in a way, psychedelic. It's a magical process. It's an inner disease of the soul that has this incredible ability to actually express itself via the medium of the outside world. So we think it's out there, and then if we actually stay caught in that viewpoint, then, oh, it's out there separate from us, and we react, and ultimately, if it's negative, we try to kill it. And meanwhile, we're enacting the very evil of Watiko in doing that. All the while thinking we're the good guys trying to destroy evil. Unwittingly, we're possessed by the very evil we're trying to destroy, which is complete and utter madness. And that's why I'm saying, yeah, we found the diagnosis for this, should be, headline news all over the world of what's afflicted our species. And but what I'm actually pointing at is that the way to heal it, on the one hand, it's a revelation, so to recognize it's a revelation, but then it's showing us something. What it's showing us is the incredible, profound, sort of the primacy of the psyche, of consciousness to create our experience. And when we realize that, that's when we begin to realize, oh my God, each one of us have this enormous, incredible creative agency and power. But to the extent that we're not awake to it, then we're outsourcing it, and the powers that be or the state or whoever are really happy to use our own unexpressed creative power and turn it against us. And that's why I keep on saying to people, the solution for this mind virus, for this incredible collective insanity, for the over-the-top evil that's playing out, is for any one of us to connect with our nature, because our nature is creative. So in other words, to connect with being creative. And the more that you realize your nature, being that your nature is creative, the more you embody and express yourself creatively. And the more you do that, the deepen your realization of your nature, in a positive feedback loop that creates light in a world of darkness.
The Gnostics believed in, I don't know if they called it Wateco specifically, but that same idea of this mind virus. And they talked about how, and a layer they added to it was how this universe actually isn't God's creation. They believe in, like, the child of Sophia, Yaldabaoth was a creator that then created this world, and it was a flawed reflection of the true world. And that's what we're constantly remembering when we're told to, I don't know, see the God in one another, is bringing back the true world that this one's sort of overlaid on top of. Does that sit with you?
Yeah. Well, the Gnostics, which really translates as, the ones who know, they have realization of the nature, of our nature, of the nature of reality. And they didn't have access to the term Watiko, but they called them the archons, these mind parasites. And it's precisely what the Native American people call Watiko. Now, and what I point out in my work, it's not just the Gnostics. Every spiritual wisdom tradition from time immemorial has been pointing at Watiko. It's just been calling it different names or having different symbols to describe it. For example, in the apocryphal text of the Bible, they talk about the counterfeiting spirit. And it has, the anti-memon pneuma is the actual, whether it's Latin or Greek or something, but, the counterfeiting spirit. And this is Watiko. That's exactly a description of Watiko, because what is Watiko? It has no creativity on its own, but it's a master impersonator. It puts us on. Putting us on has a double meaning. It fools us, putting us on, and it puts us on like a suit of clothes. So in other words, here's this counterfeiting spirit. It offers us a false version of ourselves. Oh, you're traumatized. Oh, you're wounded. And if you're not awake in that moment, and you identify with Watiko's version, with the counterfeiting spirit's version of yourself, then it has you. Then it can manipulate you and can control you. Now, if you think about what I just described, so you see the thing about this counterfeiting spirit, aka Watiko, it can't steal your soul, but it can trick you into giving your soul away. So think about what I just described with the counterfeiting spirit. You identify with who you're not, you forget who you actually are, and you disconnect from your creative agency and your creative power, which is your nature. That's a total recipe for madness. That's the counterfeiting spirit, and that's Watiko. And that's why I keep on saying this is, it has like infinite ways of manifesting all these variants, like people who seem really different and look like they're suffering from totally different, situations. No, when you really get and titrate and get to the essential, what is the malady that's informing all of these different people and groups of people, it's this mind virus. And for example, like Philip K. Dick, the great sci-fi writer, he didn't have the name Watiko. He called it the Black Iron Prison. And he says, this mimicking stuff, because remember, Watiko is the counterfeiting spirit. It's a master mime. This mimicking stuff is the key to everything. That's Philip K. Dick. What does Don Juan, Carlos Castaneda's teacher, say in the Castaneda books? He didn't have the name Watiko. He called it by different names, one of them being the predator. He says this is the topic of topics. And in my language, I would say, there is nothing more important in the world than to understand Watiko, because it contains hidden within it our creative genius, and that's the very thing that's going to heal us. But if we don't realize that, it manifests as this evil seeming demon that's destroying us.
How does this idea of Watiko differ from, say, Christianity's version of Satan?
Yeah, no, it's in my work I point out, like I so appreciate that question, I point out that it's really an equivalent term, and that's why, like in Answer to Job, which was his greatest work, I think, Jung calls Satan the godfather of humanity as a spiritual being. That without Satan, that human beings would not have spiritually awakened. Okay, that in other words, Satan, a lot of the accuser, the adversary, the father of lies, and he creates obstacles. Like it makes me think of one of my teachers, this great enlightened Tibetan Lama, one day said to me, Paul, in Tibet, all the greatest enlightened beings didn't become enlightened because things were going great. No, they became enlightened because there were incredible obstacles. There's a way of holding the obstacle that can propel you into realization of your nature. Now, the thing about Satan is so interesting because when you actually contemplate the Christ event symbolically, and I point out in one of my books that this was exactly how Christ was instructing his disciples to view what came through him. Of course, it got edited out of the Bible. It's in the apocryphal text. But Christ was basically saying, see what's happening through me symbolically. And so when you see Christ's incarnation, as if it's a dream and interpret it symbolically. There's that symbolic awareness that Jung was talking about. Well, something else happened when Christ incarnated. Isn't it interesting? At the very moment that Christ incarnated in this world, there's Satan. And I point out, yeah, that's not an accident. That was an expression of the extreme polarization in the collective unconscious at the time. The being, the dream character Christ, who's completely the incarnation of the light, and there's the Satan, the incarnation of the dark. But what Jung is saying is that they're actually part of the same being, and the same think about the incredible polarization that's happening in the body politic of the world today. It's unbelievable, the polarization. That's an expression of the incredible disassociation and polarization that's happening within the human psyche. And that's why Jung's main thing was, to the extent that any of us are able to hold that creative tension of the opposites within ourselves and not just split and identify with one of the opposites and repress the other and project the other. But no, if we're able to, and any creative person knows this, it's, holding that creative tension of the opposites, it can be kind of intense. It can be, kind of painful or challenging. But Jung points out of that comes what he calls the transcendent function, or the reconciling symbol. Think about the Christ event. Symbolically, Christ on the cross is perfect symbol of holding the tension of the opposites. And what comes out of that? Well, after his 3-day descent into the hell realm comes the resurrected body. That is the transcendent function. That is the blessing. That is the grace. That is the creative spirit.
The book that I just wrote, that I'm currently pitching to publishers, is actually about story being used as consciousness technology. So in the very beginning of this interview, when you said the story doesn't matter, inside I was like, the story always matters. But I love that you said that if you read the Bible symbolically, because that is what I feel like my life was leading me to, being raised so deeply in the church and then finding my own path after that. But as an example, in the Bible, the view that Christians in particular have of Satan is so different from just what the Bible, even the Bible that was edited and actually made it to the current Bible, talks about. Like Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, to Peter, his friend, his rock, when Peter tries to stop him from fulfilling his purpose. And not
Right.
because Peter is possessed, but because he's speaking from fear. And he calls Satan the father of lies, not a murderer with a pitchfork. It's a narrative distorter. And so when you're looking at the idea of Satan like that, I think it's so different from this like evil red guy that's popping up everywhere. It's just this natural shadow that's meant to be the contrast for us, the darkness, so that we can see our own light within it if we choose to.
Yeah, well, the thing, interestingly, in his work, Jung talks about, he calls shadow projection the lie. And I point out, isn't that interesting? Because shadow projection is the shadow in action. Well, who is the liar? Who's the father of lies? It's Satan. And Jung, he really goes into this, because I'm writing a new book about Jung, and he talks about that it's very mysterious, but God encoded in evil, there's like a special purpose that's most important for us to know. And that's why this maps onto my work with Watiko, that in my life, for example, manifested through the darkness. It actually hidden, holographically encoded and concealed within that darkness is a revelation, And so when we're dissociated, and Jung says the sickness of our time is a sickness of disassociation, that, one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, that we're split. But the idea is that, and he also says that underlying that disassociation is a pregnancy. Something is trying to be given birth to, some greater being, But the idea is that instead of just seeing the darkness as like all bad, And, that's an expression of our disassociation. That to understand, oh, there's some actual gift hidden and coded within what seems to be dark, and it's actually not even separable from the light. Because I would even say it this way, here's light that reveals darkness, but light itself is revealed through the darkness. You see, this is very Kabbalistic. In Kabbalah, they talk about, what is it, the descent on behalf of the ascent. That, in other words, you descend into the darkness of the unconscious as the way to ascend into your true body of light, And that's what I mean around the whole shamanic thing, that, I point out this point in one of my books. I have a big chapter that the major archetype activated in the collective psyche is the shamanic archetype, that we are all being called to be shamans, and shamans are the storyteller. Shamans are the dreamers. They're the creative artist, the wounded healer. And, we're making a collective descent into the underworld, which is a place of death and rebirth. And it's very dangerous because you can get really caught there. But it really helps to contextualize our process, both individually and collectively, when you have the realization, oh, I've gotten enlisted to play this deeper role in a divine drama. And so what seems to be incredible darkness happening in the world actually could be the expression of an incredible global awakening that each of us are being called to be the representatives for. But of course, how it turns out, that's yet to be seen, because we are dreaming it.
So what is your process in working with Watiko now? How does it show up for you? And then how do you get yourself to a place where you're impenetrable?
Yeah, well, no, I'm a work in progress like all of us. I'm just somebody who had a direct, unmediated encounter with archetypal evil that could have been the worst nightmare imaginable. I mean, just think about it, totally destroyed my entire family. And yet, I've been really fortunate more and more to realize, oh, it was this revelation. And what I notice is that, like, I'll give you an example. The last two of the three Watiko books, a friend of mine, he read the audiobook. Like, my publisher wanted me to read it, and I'm like, no, it's just not my thing. And so I had a friend read it, and he's this minister, a Christian minister. And he said to me when he was reading the books, he says, Paul, I can't believe what's happening. As I'm reading your books on Watiko, I am getting assaulted by demons. And I found that really funny and began laughing. And I said to him, well, imagine what it was like writing the book, And the point is that as I'm more and more like mapping and articulating and illuminating how Watiko works, because it doesn't want to be seen, because it only has power when it's not seen. When you see how it works, you take away its power, and the person who sees it becomes empowered. And so what I'm trying to say is that for me, as I'm more and more, shedding light on Watiko and sharing it with others, and thankfully this work is getting out all over the world and it's helping so many people, I'm getting more and more like assaulted by these evil demonic forces, but I've learned to interpret that like, wow, that's fantastic. That's the best news I've heard all day. That's showing me I'm on the right path. Instead of like, oh, wow, I'm really, screwed up and what's up, with me. It's like, no, of course. For example, two of my teachers, probably 40 years ago, when I was really struggling from the abuse from my father, and I was telling them about it day after day after day, and one day they said to me, Paul, it's because you have such potential for light that the demons are even interested. Okay, and I think that's the way it works for all of us, not just for me. And so the point is, to answer your question, how I navigate this role that I've been cast in is just every day. My main thing is to be creative, is to just, express myself creatively. Every morning I write my books, and just whatever I do, I'm able to access that creative spirit, and that's a result of my encounter with Watiko. It's almost like the blessing from Watiko, and that's what gets me through. And if I know if I wasn't able to have connected with my creative process, way back when, I would have been in deep trouble.
How do you see the concept of Watiko working with the new the new phase that we're in with AI?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because AI, like Watiko, it's a quantum phenomena. And once again, what I mean is that, it can incredibly serve our species and make this world a way better place and help all of us. Or it could be the most incredible nightmare and kill us all type of thing. And, there are a lot of people who feel like, oh, AI, it might be the agents of this negative ET, the extraterrestrials, and, coming through into our world via the medium of AI. And it's interesting because when somebody gets really taken over by Wateco, they become, there's no creativity programmed in when they're possessed by Wateco. They become like a robot. They become like an automaton. They become a set of conditioned program responses, as if they're controlled, as if they're being puppeteered by some other. And that's why, one of the things I talk about is the importance of us connecting with our heart, with our soul, of really accomplishing the idea of becoming a real human being with real love, with real compassion. That's our nature. And that's, in a way, the antidote for becoming robotic or, automatons or zombies, who are just this set of program conditioned responses. And I think we've all seen this when we encounter people who are, taken over by the propaganda and are mind controlled. And when you really try to talk with them, it's like you're talking to the algorithm. It's like they're just parroting, the propaganda, and they think they're the ones in possession of the truth, and they're critical thinkers and thinking for themselves, not realizing, no, they're just absolute marionettes and instruments, for this propaganda to come through. AI could be incredible benefit for our species, or it could be the worst nightmare. What concerns me is that, of course, it depends on, are we going to, in a sense, develop our sense of ethics and morality? Is that going to keep pace with the devil inside of us that's developing AI and these incredible weapons of mass destruction? One of the quotes that Jung says that I love, he says, yeah, because the fallen angels have placed these incredible, like unbelievable destructive weapons of mass destruction in our hands. And think about it. Think about that. We are investing such an unbelievable amount of our resources in creating destruction, these weapons of mass destruction. I mean, just that shows how insane we are as a species. But Jung says, because we are now in the position to ultimately destroy our own species, we have to develop what he calls, we have to achieve gnosis of the divine. In other words, we have to begin to realize consciously how we have this divine power. And this divine power is to be found within our psyche. It has to do with being creative. It has to do with, how we interpret and create our experience and place meaning on what's happening. That, is what he's pointing at by saying achieving gnosis of the divine, which we always have. We're unaware of it. And if we insist on being unaware, continue in our asleepness, then we're fated to destroy ourselves. But that's why there's such incredibly increased pressure in the alchemical vessel of the human psyche that it's actually easier to wake up if you hold that creative tension in a certain way, consciously, without splitting and dissociating.
Well, I love leaving listeners with something to bring this in more tangibly to the reality, something to focus on, whether it's a thought or an action to do this week. If you were going to leave them with one thing, what would that be?
Yeah, well, two things come to mind, but they're interrelated. So, they're sort of facets of the same jewel. On the one hand, I'm a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner, and every practitioner, there's a practice that we do, and it's called having pure perception. And pure perception is you go about your day and you imagine you're in a dream that you've become lucid in. And you just more and more like interpret every moment of your experience as if, oh my God, I've woken up in the dream and everything I'm seeing is reflecting me. That I'm inside of my psyche. Instead of being out of my mind, I'm inside of my mind. That all of this is a collective dream that we're all dreaming up. And then going along with that, because, having the realization of the dreamlike nature, really it's showing you and it's unlocking your creative spirit. And so the other thing I would say to people is just really in any way, even if it's the slightest, littlest bit, to step into your creative voice, whatever that even would look like. And I'm not talking about necessarily, it's great to paint or draw or whatever, but that's just like sort of a flatland version of being creative. The way we wash dishes is creative. The way we walk, every and any moment of our lives can be creative. And to just really step into that consciously, like stepping into the dream and recognizing it's a dream, even that's a creative act. So that's what I would love to offer.
Well, for listeners who are really resonating and want to read more of your books and connect with you online, where's the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, so, it's funny, I'm in the process. I just met with my friend just yesterday about, there's like a Substack thing that's, within a month or so will be up, but it's not quite up yet. But I have a website, and the way I share it is that if you want to awaken in the dream, go to awakeninthedream.com. That's AWAKEN, inthedream.com. And there's a ton of articles. It's all for free, a ton of, interviews like this, because I just want to get this information out because it's medicine.